because we were in Florida, to just be in his shirt sleeves for the picture taking. We had a small wood-burning stove in the place where we were staying. It was in the kitchen area, and that's where everybody congregated because it was the only warm place in the house. And in an empty lot beside us, there that the landlord owned, were a number of very tall palm trees with just a few fronds on top, as most of them are in Florida. Well, the landlord told Dad if he wanted to cut a couple down, to go ahead and he could use the wood. So Dad got a hold of a cross-cut saw, and he and Uncle Ace started sawing. There was so much pitch, every few minutes they had to stop and put turpentine on the saw, or it wouldn't move. But we were sure grateful for the wood. One day there was a big explosion. Some oil tanks several blocks from us had blown up and were on fire, and we were being warned in a large area that more tanks might go, but they didn't. I wasn't with the group that went to the fair at the time Dad hit a cow. It just ambled right in front of him, and it rolled with its back right up on the hood of the car, first puncturing the radiator, letting all the water out, and breaking off the temperature gauge, making a great big dent in the hood. Of course, the car had to be towed home, and it took some time to have it fixed. The woman across the street from us gave vocal lessons, and wouldn't you know it, Dad signed me up. He used to enjoy hearing me sing along with the records, and thought I could sing as high as Gallicurci at one time. The one and only time I ever sang a solo was at a community gathering for tourists. I was scared to death. This same group tried to do things to entertain the tourists, which weren't very many in those days. Mother learned how to make sugared orange and grapefruit peel and marmalade. Louise Hall was a home ec teacher in one of the schools, and the day we visited, she had the class whipping Jell-O. Those poor kids were using hand beaters and kept coming to her to see if they had beaten enough, and she kept saying, "No, not now, not yet." Dad had to get back to jobs up north, so he went back on the train, and I think Uncle Asa went with him because Uncle Ori drove us back, Aunt Ollie, Mom, Grandma, Pugsley, and me. We took the long way, as it was decided we would visit Washington, D.C. Someplace in Virginia, it was raining hard, and the roads were muddy and slippery. The car slid into a ditch, and there was no way of getting out without help. There was a house about a half a block away, and Uncle Ori went to see if maybe someone lived there. Maybe they had a truck. The house was gray from being weather-beaten. Well, a family did live there, and the man had a horse, which was better than a truck in that mud. We, the women, were invited to come in the house, and the men worked on the car. There were 2 or 3 children, and they were quite curious. Probably hadn't seen folks all winter. Aunt Ollie had some gum she gave them, and such smacking you never heard. Because of the cold, they slept, ate, and lived in one room. But the girls went into another closed-off room and brought in their corncob dolls for us to see. We spent a few days in Washington and then on home in time for me to go to school. It wasn't long before we had a math test, and I was the only one in the class to get 100. Miss Marks, my teacher, I think, was quite surprised. My vocal lessons were continued, and I started piano lessons. Dad bought me a brand new Cable Nelson piano, and I know I didn't show the proper enthusiasm and appreciation. After a lesson, my teacher, Joy Carson, would send a note home saying how well I had done, and Dad would say, "Think what you could do if you really practiced." Poor Dad, he tried so hard to make some kind of a musician out of me, and I think Aunt Laura was disappointed too. She had been a piano and organ teacher in Talladega, Alabama, in a black school. I knew I would never be a success on the piano because all I could do was play the notes I saw. No frills. My hands were too small to reach even an octave. And as for vocal lessons, I was just too shy and scared to amount to anything. It helped a little when in the evening I would play accompaniments for Dad to play his violin. Soon he would say he couldn't saw lumber all day and a violin at night, and go and get his Saturday Evening Post and a box of chocolate-covered cherries and head off to bed. Also, maybe he was a little pleased when I got to college. I decided I'd like to sing in the chorus, which also made up much of the church choir. When I went to Prof. Wilson and told him I was interested, he said, "What do you sing?" And I said, "Soprano." And he said, "Do you have a cold?" I said, "No." "Well," he said, "you sure sound like an alto to me." And from that day on, I have been an alto. One Sunday in church, a religious group had come. I know they were called the Buckman something or other. And just as the speaker was assuring us all that the Lord was right there with us, a huge sheet of ice slid off the steep roof. Well, the congregation really sat up and thought maybe he really knew what he was talking about. Our house on Lakeshore Drive was 20 or so steps up from the road, and Mother would put a card in the window saying how much ice or milk she wanted, and the delivery would bring it up the stairs to us. The ice box was on a little back porch. There was a hole in the floor and a funnel so the melted ice could drip out of the box onto the ground. One day, Dad decided to enlarge the kitchen and bought Mom a new beautiful Magic Chef stove. That was quite a day, and the men who delivered it couldn't believe someone still had such an old, inefficient gas stove. I wonder if it went to a museum. Our neighbors were the Hills and the Heises. Dad had built both places. Our garage was in the basement, so we always had a warm car in the winter. But backing up the hill driveway and then going down the hill to Lakeshore Drive was tricky in the winter in the snow and ice. Without the help of cinders from the furnace, we never would have made it. I still remember sliding down the hill, sometimes sideways, onto the street with Dad, and even when I drove. We were so lucky to have never encountered another car. And getting back up was more impossible because we had to make several trips and slide back down and start up again. One day early in the days when Dad was building, a woman approached him and said, "Young man, don't you know the Bible says you should not build your house upon sand?" And Dad replied, "That was before cinders were available, ma'am." In the summer, I visited Aunt Fern and Uncle Leo for a couple of weeks at a time in their new, beautiful house that they had built up on the north end of town, the first lot inside the city limits. Uncle Leo was a pattern maker and had done very well during the war, and then afterwards he made furniture and did refinishing and that sort of thing. The home had lots of walnut used like a wide banister on the staircase, and the mantel and pillars on the fireplace. Aunt Fern was a stenographer and a very good one. She had gone to work right out of high school. With neither of them having a college education, Uncle Leo didn't feel it was necessary and said so. Aunt Fern had a character for a boss, Art Jones. He would be in jail today for his harassment, as he likes the hand-on approach, but she knew how to handle him. One day she was laughing when she came home and said Art had said, "Boy, was I sick. I was in bed 3 days with a nurse." Aunt Fern used to like to have me pluck her eyebrows when I was there. I did a fair amount of dating in high school, but being out so far from town made it almost impossible without a car. And 3 boys walked out. Howard Bell was one of them. They came to the door, and as I was talking to them, Dad came out and said I wasn't receiving gentlemen callers. Sometime after that, a couple weeks or so, there was a knock on the door, and when I opened it, there was a box about 8 by 8 by 8 on the floor. It was addressed to me, so I opened it. It was full of grass, paper, mud, stones, and I don't know what all. I never knew for sure who brought it, but had a pretty good idea. How could I forget Chambers Island? Uncle Ori had bought this island up in Green Bay. I think Dad and Uncle Frank had put in $1,000 apiece. It had been a girls' school, which had folded, and Uncle Ori invited all the families and maybe more too to go up and stay a week or two while the cooks were still there. Well, we all went that year and a couple of years after that. You had to reach it by boat from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and carry all your supplies with you. But it was such a beautiful place. I was younger and older than some and remember feeling like the Shire Country's cousin and I stuck with the adults that I knew. It took 2 days and 1 night to get there. We always stayed, I'm not sure, but it seems like it was Washington, Wisconsin. And after a long ride and dinner, everyone would climb a couple hundred steps, maybe not quite that many, but over 100, up to a church that overlooked the whole town. It seems that was the thing to do in that town. Then on the next morning, we would stop at Egg Harbor and see and pick up the white egg-like stones along the edge of the bay. a town called Fish Creek came into the picture there someplace too. Maybe that's where we took the boat from. I guess I don't really remember. Anyway, the dining room was stocked with beautiful Wedgwood china, and it was decided among the families when they sold the place that each family would get some of that china. And I think Mother had a dinner plate and a large platter, which I think eventually, when Dad moved to Tucson, went to Renee. Grandma Pugsley came to live with us. I don't recall whether she had her stroke before she came or after. She was very heavy, and Mother had to lift her bodily from a chair to the bed and to the bathroom and so on. Dad had made a frame with casters on it to be able to put a more comfortable chair on it than having her sit in a wheelchair all day. I thought it was too much for Mom to have to do, but there was no other way. Grandma was unhappy, particularly if I had a date, and she would show it. Her speech was impaired, and all she could say was melody, 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 melody. But she sure could make you know what she was thinking when she was displeased. She could sing word for word an old song called "Go Tell Aunt Abby That Her Old Gray Goose Is Dead," but got very frustrated when she tried to say words. She died there in the house, and the funeral service was there too. But burial was back in Pawpaw. I'm afraid I used a couple of my dates. A red-headed Jewish boy named Marvin Krieger, whose father owned a shoe store there, and I didn't even buy my shoes there. He had a Buick sedan. By this time we did too. After school, he and Tom Baker, a president of the bank's son, would drive us out to the beach and teach me how to drive on the hilly roads of Long Beach. Dad could hardly believe how well I could drive when he finally decided to teach me. I rewarded the Jewish boy by going to the prom with the banker's son. I was a stinker. Dad had never let me dance, but I went to proms anyway. Went to the junior prom with the football coach's son, Tom Gill. Another date, Babe Brown, who was much older than I and lived not far from us, had a cabin cruiser. To digress, his mother and sister had an ice cream stand down by the harbor bridge where they sold ice cream in sugar cones that they had made by hand on a waffle iron and then shaped them while they were hot. It's part of Michigan City history. How it got started, I don't know, but he asked me out and had me get a few friends together, and we would go out on the boat and have a potluck. The group always wanted my mother's goulash. One night we went out in rather rough weather, and 3 of us were up on deck with our backs against the cabin. Of course we had rubber-soled shoes on, which were a rule. Well, water had washed up over the deck, and as I tried to brace myself, as the boat would tip, my feet slipped, and I slid right over to the side with my feet dangling over the edge, and it was pitch black outside. I heard people yell, "She's overboard," and I would have been had there not been a rather flimsy railing to catch me. Needless to say, we inched our way back to the area down behind the cabin. I did have one boyfriend the family, even Aunt Flora and Uncle Frank, really approved of. Naturally, I didn't like him that much. He was the son of one of the women in the church circle with Mom. His name was Richard Chubb. When we dated, I drove our car, as he had none. He was a big fellow, played football, and got a scholarship to Purdue. Aunt Laura and Uncle Frank, even at their suggestion, took me down to Lafayette to a football game. Yes, he thought things were going pretty well, because he invited me down to his fraternity to their big dance. And after I had accepted and I got so nervous about it, I wrote and told him I couldn't make it. He had it all set up for me to stay in a sorority house and everything. Needless to say, that was the end of that friendship. I was in every play I could get into in high school and college and even in little theater after I came home from college. I wasn't scared there. I think maybe it was because I was speaking other people's words. In high school, I was on the staff of the school paper and the yearbook. Goldie Shepherd sponsored the paper and the yearbook. She was our lit teacher. And she also coached the plays. And her brother Emery coached the little theater. I liked math and sciences best, except when the biology teacher wrapped a snake around her arm and hand and chased me around the room, insisting I touch it. Everyone was supposed to, and I was the only holdout, I guess, but I never did. One of the downstairs bedrooms was made into an office, and Dad had prospective clients in there to discuss plans and so forth. And I remember Chet Glidden and Renee Warner and Elsie Glidden, Chet's sister, and Pat Mathias coming. Chet and Elsie were Uncle Ori's and Aunt Ollie's children, and Uncle Ori had given them each a lot and a house of their choice as a wedding gift. Dad built both houses. I felt like the country cousin and tried to be out of sight when they came. They were our rich relatives. When I said something to Renee about it many, many years later, she couldn't believe it. She said, well, why? She couldn't believe why I felt that way. And she said, I was only 19, and what did I know about what I wanted? Dad liked to go out on the fishing tugs, and when we had company, he would take them in. They raved about the fish they ate coming back in. It would be prepared by cleaning a large trout or a whitefish, wrapping it in water-soaked newspapers, and put on the coals in the boiler. The meat fell right off the bones. Mother used to have her high school class come. They got together once a year for a reunion at someone's home. They were all pretty good sized. I think there were maybe 8 of them. On looking at the pictures that were taken, each year the length of the line seemed to get longer and longer. One day, I had an automobile accident. I was taking Mother, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was taking Mother and a neighbor for a little ride. And everything was going fine, but all of a sudden I saw this car coming very fast behind us. And just as we came to a little rise in the road, the car tried to pass me. Well, a car was coming the other way, and he had to cut in so quickly that it nicked the front of my car, breaking the wheel and pushing me to the right over the curb and the sidewalk up about a 3-foot embankment, beautiful grass embankment in front of a house. And as the car rolled back down, it gouged this great big hole in the grass and came to a rest. Well, this man hopped out of the car and that had hit me and came rushing over, and he said, it's all my fault, it's all my fault. I'll take care of everything. My sister will take you home. And he got back in his car and off he went. Luckily, his car wasn't damaged, apparently. But it was Dr. Lee Kerrigan, our doctor, and he was off to an emergency. Well, I don't know how the sister happened to be there, but she took us home, and I remember Dad was in bed reading Sunday afternoon, and I dashed up to tell him that I'd had an accident. Of course, he wasn't very happy, but happy that I wasn't hurt or no one was hurt. One winter, Uncle Ori and Aunt Ollie went to Florida and asked Dad to keep a check on their house. He and I would walk through the snow at night, probably a mile or a mile and a quarter, and check the place out, and then what a treat. They had a radio, and we listened between squawks and squeals to KDKA, East Pittsburgh, and to Schenectady, New York. WGY, was that it? Among others marveling at such an invention. It was a long, cold walk there and back, and the house was cold, but it was worth it. And of course, it wasn't very long before Dad had to have a radio. I remember there were 2 boxes and a great big black horn portable that could be moved around where we were. Once in a while in the summer, we would see something bobbing along out, maybe about a block out in the lake. And it was Johnny Weissmiller, we learned. Uncle Asa got a little Ford coupe and would stop by the house and ask me to take him someplace. He didn't really like to drive, but I did, and so that was fine, until he started putting his shaky hands on my knee. And when he would stop at the house, he did the same thing. One day he said, I don't think you like me. And I told him, not as long as you can't keep your hands to yourself. He got up and left and never came back. Shortly after that, he gave his car to one of the wire girls. I'm sure I would have gotten it if I'd been nice to him. One day, a man came to the church recruiting students for Olivet College. Reverend Hall contacted Dad, and wouldn't you know it, he signed me up. We did go up to see the campus before I had to go up in the fall. We went on from there to visit Aunt Jen in Lansing. Uncle Hiram had died by now. He used to work in the Capitol in Lansing. I don't know what he did, but they lived just about a half a block from the Capitol building. But one thing I remember about Aunt Jen, when she would be baking a cake, she would crumble what was left of the cake that she'd had just before and put it into the batter. That was an early version of recycling. Dad, nobody had really talked about college, but I said I thought I would be going to the University of Michigan, and Dad said, it's too big. If you will go to a small school for a couple of years, then you can transfer to the university. But after 2 weeks at Olivet, I wouldn't have changed for anything. The dorm was very old, and the enrollment was quite small. The whole school ate in the dining room on part of the first floor of the dorm. I liked my education courses taught by Prof. Barnes, and psychology taught by the president of the college, Dr. King, and the biology taught by Dr. Forrester, even though the day we had lab, and after dissecting an embryo pig, we always, and I mean always, had pork for dinner. I was not a good student, as I have said on many occasions. A's and B's in high school, but not in college. There were 3 fraternities and 3 sororities on campus, and competition for pledges started early. My roommate was Ida Rose Maurer. We nicknamed her Posy. I had been nicknamed Mickey in high school by Neat Calvert because, as she said, there were too many Kathys and Kates and Kitties and so forth. There were 5 others of us in our group, and we were rushed by all 3 sororities. We decided to play hard to get, and when we finally made up our mind which one we wanted to belong to, which turned out to be Sigma Beta, we avoided eye contact with its members, keeping them in the dark right up to the signing the fall of our sophomore year. It was lots of fun. I have a memory book full of things that went on at Olivet. I'm sure it shows I had a pretty good time. I learned to dance with strong girl leaders, and I loved it. My first year, I dated a Phi Alpha by the name of Harold Bud Bassett. He was a wonderful dancer, and I know that's the only reason I went with him. We'd go to the sorority house after dinner and dance for an hour or so with others. A fellow by the name of Phil Reno. Everyone said we looked alike. He didn't have a sister, and I didn't have a brother, so we called each other brother or sister. Well, Phil played the piano by ear, and we kept him at the piano as long as we could. One day in the spring, I was in the library, and I saw Bud and this fellow that I didn't know looking at me and talking, and so I asked Bud what they had been talking about, and he said, well, he says he likes your looks. And I said, well, you can go tell him I don't like his. He looks like a drunkard. One Sunday afternoon, my freshman year, 3 couples were going on a date, and I don't remember who they were or whose car it was, but it was decided to go to Jackson to a movie. Well, I had never been to a movie on Sunday, and I was sure I was going to go to hell right there. And what was I going to tell my parents? To top it off, we were late getting back to the dorm, and we had to ring the bell for the dean to let us in. Well, that was a pretty unhappy time for me. In the summer after my freshman year, I decided I didn't want to be tied to just one fellow. I just wanted to have a good time, and told Bud so. He apparently cried on that drunkard's shoulder, who was a fraternity brother. In the fall after we got back to school. And at stand-up, our faculty, staff, and student get acquainted night, the drunkard asked me to dance. and then to walk me back to the dorm. And that was our beginning. I think he looked that way. He had circles under his eyes, looked sort of emaciated, but he was an orphan, and he lived with his grandfather. And the summer before, he had hitched his way east. I don't think he'd been eating very well or something. Anyway, he didn't look very healthy. After pledging, all the pledges stayed in their respective houses. I hadn't even told John which one I would be in. So with his Phi Alpha pals, they serenaded all 3 sororities, and he sang a solo, Stardust, which turned out to be our song. We even had it played at our wedding. John didn't like to dance, and he wasn't very good at it. But we went to all of our sorority and fraternity parties. He lived at the Phi Alpha house, and in the morning would come over and whistle under my window, and I would go down and have breakfast with him, which was disastrous because I ballooned up to 130 pounds. One night, John borrowed Don Crawford's, who was a fraternity brother, borrowed his car to take me to dinner in Charlotte. Of course, I drove because John never did. And when we got in the car to come home, the horn started blowing, and it wouldn't stop. Well, John got out and put up the hood and saw a couple wires and pulled them. That was fine. It stopped the horn all right, but it also put out the lights. And I had to drive home in moonlight. One night, leaving Sigma, I stepped on the edge of the doormat and really sprained my ankle. You could just hear it pop. With the help on each side, I hopped back to the dorm about a block across lots. And then John actually carried me up the stairs to my room. It was a long flight of stairs because the first floor had very high ceilings. We yelled, "Man on second," and all the girls that were properly dressed peeked out to see what was going on. The football trainer was called, and he said to put it in hot water and then cold water and keep alternating that for a while. And the next morning he came over and taped my ankle. One of the things we used to enjoy, at least I did, was walking down the hill to the post office, and as we went greeted people, we had to greet everybody, townspeople and all. It was a small town, and everybody was supposed to know everybody. After we graduated at the end of my sophomore year and got a job in Chicago, I went back for the first semester of my junior year, and I went to all the frat dances, and John knew it, but he realized it was just because I liked to dance. And I'll brag a little and say I was considered pretty good at it. In the year we were together, we would take milk and sugar and butter out of the dining room, and John had cocoa and sometimes peanut butter. And we'd go into the cold kitchen at Sigma, and he would make fudge and popcorn that we shared with the other kids that came into the sorority. I even left Olivet with an incomplete in Miss Schinleber's art class, which I didn't deserve. I knew I had completed the work she had said I hadn't, but I would have had to go back on campus to prove it, and so I just didn't bother. I had several formals, but my favorite was a black with silver tube-like beads around the bottom of the large sleeves, and Mr. Calvert liked it too and took a picture of me, which is in one of the albums. John stayed at Olivet during the summer, working on the new girls' dorm, which I never got to live in. And by fall, he had his job with NBC. Of course, we didn't have laundromats in those days for sending laundry back and forth, and Mom always put cookies in it with the clean clothes when she sent it back to me. I had registered to vote. All the family were Republicans, and when Roosevelt was running, Mother said if she thought it would make a difference, she would come up and carry me home on her back to vote against him. By the end of John's senior year, he had proposed, and when Dad and Mom came to pick me up for the summer, I can still see Dad putting things in the trunk of the car and John standing beside him telling him we were very fond of each other and wanted to be seeing each other as often as possible, but wanted Dad's permission. I think Dad would have liked to reply the same as he had to the 3 boys who had walked out from town to see me, but realized it was inevitable. I should have talked about this before, but one of the fun things we did, one of our group, Dorothy Meeker, went home for the weekend, and we thought we'd kind of play a trick on her when she came back. So instead of short-sheeting her, we borrowed a lot of alarm clocks, and we put them, we set them for different times to go off during the night. And we put them in dresser drawers, and we put them in closets, and we tied them to the springs under the beds, and just every place. Well, horror. Her mother drove her back and was going to stay with her overnight. Well, we didn't know what to do. So we just left things the way they were, and thank goodness her mother was a good sport and thought it was a lot of fun. Well, the Depression was in full swing, and I agreed to leave school. As Aunt Laura said, "Why go back? You got your man." I really had never thought of it that way, and it was just another cutting remark that upset Mother and Dad. The folks rented rooms, which was the only thing that kept things going. Not much work, and when there was, people weren't paying. I can remember Dad paid a dental bill that I had because Dr. Hall, the dentist, owed Dad some money. And so he just canceled it. I did washing and ironing for people that stayed a week or so, and I also helped clean cottages. Well, I went home, and the first Indiana pageant, Miss Indiana pageant, was to be in Michigan City. And Wani Hayes, who lived next door, worked at the Tivoli Theater where it was to be held. And she talked me into entering by promising me 20 or 25 free passes to the movies. One of our roomers, Mrs. Borofsky, who was the wife of a doctor, insisted that I wear a beautiful formal of hers. And I had a white wool bathing suit. I was told I came in, fairly high, maybe third, but in those days there were no runners up, but I got my theater passes. The little money I made doing those jobs made it possible for me to go into Chicago and visit John once in a while. He was living with very distant relatives, and they had an extra room, or maybe I took his room and he slept on the couch, I don't remember. But I loved to visit the NBC studios, seeing Jack Benny and Don McNeil and Amos and Andy, not Amos and Andy while they were doing their program, but I met them. And many of the big bands, particularly